Hey guys, Big Al here. So today we're going to be talking about some 9/11 conspiracies and specifically what happened after 9/11. So 7 days after 9/11, there were anthrax letters that were released to the senators and someone who worked for a news station and also an editor in a newspaper. So first letter was released September 18th and then the second batch of them was released on October 9th. The letters had a powder in them, so when you received the letter and you touched it, either by touching the letter and getting it on your hands, if you had a cut, you would get cutaneous anthrax, and if you had breathed it in, you would get
inhalation anthrax.
As you can see, the letters that were sent to the senators, there is a return address on them for Franklin Park, New Jersey, which I googled maps and is only 20 minutes away from Princeton, New Jersey, which is where the letters were finally traced to being sent from. They also labeled it coming from a fourth grader, which was probably to increase the odds of the senators opening it, because they probably wouldn't think that a fourth grader would be a terrorist and be like putting anthrax in a letter. So obviously, since the letters were sent out 7 days after 9/11 happened, the FBI's first suspect was Al-Qaeda, basically because they had just, caused 9/11, so they thought it has to be them also doing this. This theory was quickly debunked because they actually discovered that the letters, like I said, were traced back to Princeton, New Jersey, and they also found that the trace of anthrax that was used was traced back to a domestic lab. This lab is Fort Detrick, which is a U.S. States Army Research Institute, and they have an infectious disease center there. So basically they just study infectious diseases like anthrax and other things. So in 2001, the government wrongfully suspected Stephen Hatfield. Now, there was no evidence about anything about him doing any terrorist acts, about him hating the government, nothing like that. All he was that he was a worker for the infectious disease department at Fort Detrick. So Stephen Hatfield, they put him in jail, they went through the whole trial and everything, and then they were like, oops, we made a mistake, he didn't actually do it, so they exonerated him. When they released him, they made this claim. We have concluded, based on laboratory access records, witness accounts, and other information, that Dr. Hatfield did not have access to the particular anthrax used in the attacks, and that he was not involved in the anthrax mailings. Just weird to me that, they would literally just jump to conclusions and, they convicted this guy with little to no evidence. That's a pretty fast-moving case. I mean, most trials last very long, and for them to have convicted him and, already had put him in jail and then exonerated him in this, period of time doesn't make sense. There's something up here. The person that they actually end up convicting, and to this day, when you look it up, that is the person that is the one who was responsible, I guess, for the anthrax mailings. So the FBI ended up blaming Bruce Ivins, who was a biodefense researcher at Fort Detrick, and he worked specifically with RMR 1029. But again, many other people worked there. Many other people worked with this specific type of anthrax. Now, based on little evidence, they had suspected him, and the only substantial thing that they had going for them was that he worked with the RMR 1029. When they looked into it, they actually found that this strain wasn't that accurate, that you really couldn't link it to RMR 1029, that yes, there were some chemical compounds that were similar, but each of the letters had a variation to it, and it wasn't really exact enough to have traced it back to this specific batch. Which is interesting that they so strongly claim that it was this batch, when maybe it wasn't. Another thing that was interesting about this theory was that Fort Detrick is located in Frederick, Virginia. Now, that is 3 hours and 20 minutes away from Princeton, New Jersey. Now, there was a statement that released that said, investigators can't place Ivins in New Jersey when the letters were mailed, and they can't say for sure how he could have converted the anthrax into a powder, which is a process other scientists said would have been very difficult to perform without being noticed. So, someone had realized this and had said this in the investigation, and yet the FBI never looked into further people. They never looked into someone else who could have made it to New Jersey and back. We're talking about a 6-hour and 40-minute trip without traffic. So, the fact that he went missing for 7 or more hours and no one noticed him being gone, and also no one can place him ever messing with the anthrax, turning it into a powder, is weird. And the last thing that someone analyzed after Ivans had passed is the handwriting. And you can tell clearly that this is not a match. And handwriting analysts had even analyzed it, and they said that there's no match, like in the strokes and everything, there's not a match. It's not him. He didn't write it. So he had to have had help from other people. But the FBI never investigated who else he could have been working with. They just said, nope, Bruce Ivans did it. He was the only one who did it. They basically had no reason to convict him of terrorism, which is a pretty strong crime to convict someone of. And I think that this kind of explains why Ivans decided to take his own life. Because he kind of knew that he was stuck in a situation, he wasn't getting out of it, and it didn't really matter how little evidence they had, he was going to be convicted. So as a medical profession and a biologist, he probably would know that Tylenol isn't the best way to go, and also he probably had access to many other harsher drugs. So when people analyzed this, it didn't really make sense, and they thought, maybe the government killed him off? Who knows? As I looked into this whole situation more, I found a case that was just so seemingly similar. Now, this one happened in 1953, and conveniently at Fort Detrick, which at the time was called Camp Detrick. Frank Olson had a very mysterious death. The official explanation was that in 1953, Olson unwittingly took LSD in a CIA experiment and leaped to his death from a 13th-floor window. His family says he was murdered to maintain secrets about the government weapons program. How would someone unknowingly take LSD? Well, the government was testing people with LSD at the time. The thing that really scares me is that when you look into this, there was a trial. So Congress kept hitting roadblocks, and CIA staffers claimed that they couldn't remember details about many of the human experimentations or even the number of people that were involved. So they decided, okay, let's look into the records. Well, surprise, there was a small problem. In 1973, the director of the MK Ultra told the workers, hey, it would be a great idea if the files were destroyed. And the reasoning behind this was the privacy and embarrassment that the participants might have because they didn't know they were involved. But it's kind of weird that they just destroyed everything. There's no evidence of them doing anything. They just destroyed it all. The family of Frank Olson, when he died, they had thought that he was just so stressed out from work and he decided to commit suicide and he jumped from this 13-story building. Kind of like how Bruce Ivans committed suicide. And so the family thought this was suspicious. When his wife had passed away, they were like, let's bury them together. So they had exhumed the body, and while it was exhumed, they were like, hey, let's perform another autopsy on it. So the 1953 medical report done immediately after Dr. Olson's death indicated that there were cuts and abrasions on the body. Theory sparks about Olson having been assassinated by the CIA. When a second autopsy was performed, his team searched the body for any cuts and abrasions and found none. Stars found a large hematoma on the left side of Olson's head and a large injury on his chest. Most of the team concluded that the blunt force trauma to the head and the injury to the chest had not occurred during the fall, but most likely in the room before the fall. So basically, they said this is very suggestive of a homicide. Which makes you wonder, if you exhumed Bruce Ivans' body and did a toxicology report, would you actually find Tylenol in it, or was he drugged with something stronger? Was the government just trying to cover something up? In Frank Olson's case, I think that he had too much knowledge about weapons. So did Bruce Ivans find out too much about anthrax and their plans with it, and they had to drug him and kill him off and blame him for something? I don't know. Just the weird connection between the two, that they both worked at Fort Detrick. They both worked as biowarfare scientists. They both worked with anthrax. They both worked in that whole medical field. And that they both ended up committing suicide is very interesting. And later knowing that Frank Olson actually didn't probably commit suicide, and that's very reminiscent of a homicide, is interesting, because what if Bruce Ivans is the same? So all of this kind of begs the question, did the government target them? Did they send out these anthrax letters to kind of scare the public because they wanted to make a vaccination against it just in case biowarfare did happen? I mean, the CIA has done kind of crazy things before. I mean, they drugged their own employees with LSD just to see what would happen. So it's not really so far-fetched to say that they would release anthrax into the public to kind of scare people enough into wanting them to make a vaccination for it just because of biological warfare. Also, the fact that it came so close to 9/11 really just makes me think, was it a coincidence? And I know that there's so many conspiracies out there about how, like, the government did 9/11, whatever, and I don't really know if I believe any of that, but 7 days is not enough time to plan something. So it obviously was planned before 9/11 happened, and whether that was with the knowledge that 9/11 was coming or without the knowledge of 9/11, I don't know. So I dug deeper into this whole CIA theory that, like, they were the ones that caused the anthrax letters and they kind of set them out. And this is what I found. Someone named Matt DeHart. He worked for the U.S. Army and he was honorably discharged. There was no records why he was honorably discharged. It didn't tell him why, but they said vaguely that it was kind of because of his ADHD and depression. But the papers cite no reason as to why he was discharged. Now, a couple months before he was discharged from the Army, he started working with a hacktivist group called Anonymous. And I'm sure the government didn't like that. I'm sure they found out about it, and that is the reason why they discharged him. He wasn't in the Army anymore, but when he was in the Army, he worked with a program called Shell, and he specifically worked with drones. So his friend kind of texted him, emailed him one day, and was like, hey man, like, I found leaked files from the government, the CIA, on Shell about drones. Now, this isn't something that should be, like, made public. So he was kind of like, oh no, like, what did they leak? So he went on to look. When he looked at these leaked documents, he found hundreds of pages, and some of them having to do with the CIA and things that they had done in the past, and one of them being the anthrax letters. He found evidence supporting the CIA being in charge of sending out the anthrax letters, which kind of gives me chills. So he saves it on a flash drive, he hides it in his house, and sure enough, a month later, the FBI comes knocking on his door to seize all of his laptops, computers, electronics, everything in his house because he had been reported for child pornography. Now, I kind of looked into child pornography arrests a little bit, and that's not what they do. Now, once this happened, he had told his parents about the files that he had found, and they for sure thought that that was the reason why the FBI had come. And his story is super long. He talks about how it makes perfect sense that they would blame him and say that he's a child pornographer because it completely discredits him for anything else. And if he ever tried to release anything about the CIA causing the anthrax attacks, no one would believe this guy. His whole journey is really insane. He was arrested, he was tortured, he was given psychotics instead of antipsychotics, and it caused him to have a mental breakdown. He had to go to the hospital, and then he was given more psychotics to make him go crazy. He was put in solitary. He wasn't fed enough. He wasn't given water. He was completely tortured. Like, he was involved in child pornography, and that was the reasoning behind all of this, but that seems way too serious and intense. I don't know if the CIA was in charge or operated this whole anthrax letter situation. I think some of the theories out there definitely make sense. I think that there are very weird connections between Bruce Ivins and Frank Olson. And I think what Matt DeHart found and how he was treated is very, like, blown out of proportion for someone who just committed a child pornography crime. All of it is very weird. All of it's very sketchy. There's not a lot of information when you do go and try and look for it. And that just kind of begs the question, is there more to the story? And that is for you to decide. Thanks for watching, guys. Like this video and subscribe to my channel. I will be having more conspiracies coming soon. Don't worry, they will be super cool, I promise. And that's it. I'll see you next time. Roar, alligators, roar. Roar!